I think I'm going to risk things and not read anything that I've written and simply show you the pictures and try quickly to say what I wanted to say about them ad lib. So forgive me if it's too fast and furious. This is the first picture by Leonid that I wanted to show you. It's of his mother. She was an illiterate. She was the wife of an innkeeper, a sort of a lodging house for travelling hauliers. And they had this inn that they didn't own. And at the end of Leonid's life, he wrote a short memoir about his mother and his memory when he was 8 years old in Odessa when there was a pogrom. And he describes it. He says, "You could feel something unusual was coming. The streets were empty. There was a silence. Windows waited. The afternoon held its breath. Far away, whoops and whistles gradually came into focus. You could hear the high-pitched shrieks of the market women, a continued crescendo, and at its heart, a swaying, bestialized mass like some ponderous thing crawling down the Kobyevskaya towards our house. Our gate was already bolted. My father managed to slam the postern shut. The wagoners and draymen had all left before Easter, and only our family were left in our deserted courtyard. I can remember very clearly that I was pacing the wide waste of the yard, childishly armed with a small chain with which I would defend my family. But I cannot remember how it was that I found myself in one of the inn's empty rooms, where my mother must have tried to hide us. When the crowd reached our gate, my mother, a thin, frail woman, opened the ground floor window, clambered out, and threw herself on her knees in front of the drunken, riotous crowd, begging them to pity her children. They were so surprised, the leaders called off the pack and they went on. And that was how Mama's heroic maternal courage saved us. There were many people killed. The Odessa pogrom of 1871 was rapidly succeeded by more violence in 1881, 86, and 1905, when there's clear evidence of tacit tsarist connivance, particularly in the pogroms of 1905, where up to 2,500 Jews, many of them children, were killed. Leonid's life spanned not only the pogroms, but 2 world wars, 2 totalitarian regimes, 3 revolutions, famine, and civil war. And I'm going to focus on a series of images which gives you some sense of the fragility of this history and the extraordinary chance nature of what survived from it, even in material terms of his pictures. By the late 1880s, Leonid's artistic career was sufficiently well established for him to leave Odessa for Moscow, and he took with him his young future wife, Rosalia, next. I think this is an absolutely beautiful ink and wash portrait of her. They were married in the Moscow synagogue in 1889. Boris was born in 1890, and Leonid has a lovely picture of him with Rosalia, the next. One of the interesting things about this picture is that I think he was experimenting with focus. The background of the next room is in sharp focus, and the foreground of Rosalia and Boris in skirts, as in the photograph, is broken up. It's much more impressionistic. He loved leaving broad patches of bare canvas, as he has done in the enclosing space of this picture. He was technically a very experimental an absolutely beautiful artist. I hope you'll get some sense of this. Okay, then he was they were followed by Alexander. So that's Boris, and then his younger brother, Alexander, and then Josephine and Lydia. And by 1894, Leonid had joined the faculty of the Moscow School of Art. It was hard enough for Jews to leave the Pale of Settlement, especially for the capital, and it was unheard of for Jews to be accepted for employment in what was a government post without becoming baptized. Leonid's only other Jewish colleague in the School of Art, Levitan, had genuinely converted to Christianity, but Leonid refused. Uniquely, he was employed, but only as a supernumerary teacher with no possibility of promotion, pension, or awards. The sort of main steps of his early career are marked by several important pictures. The next one. This picture is called Letter from Home. There are 3 soldiers here. One has received a letter from home, from his village. You can see the envelope, but he can't read. And so one of the other soldiers is reading it aloud to him, and he's listening. It's very clear how attentively he's listening. This picture was bought by Tretьяков, and it's in the Tretьякov collection. And there was an exhibition of Leonid's work in the Tretьякov Gallery, in 2002 or so. And this picture, there were a lot of pictures, but this one, it was extraordinary. It absolutely glows with light. Leonid brought light into his canvases in a way that is riveting. I was completely taken aback when I saw it among all the other works, because it was so luminous. The next work actually has the same luminosity. This is called, Before the Examination. And these are some students, and they're doing their revision, or at least one of them is certainly not doing his revision. But this is a medic, and somebody else is working hard, and somebody may not be misthinking hard. This was painted and shown in the World Fair, turn of the century, in Paris. And it was purchased by the Jeu de Paume, and it now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay. And again, even in a collection like the Musée d'Orsay, there are works there that do stick out. And this one, in its very quiet way, also does. At the beginning of the 1890s, the other important thing that happened to Pasternak was that he met Tolstoy. Tolstoy was a keen observer of the current art scene, and here he is at the vernissage of the collection by the artistic group called the Передвижники. Leonid had already been commissioned to do the illustrations for a sort of serialized reprint of War and Peace. He was going to do 4 illustrations, and he was very worried about not knowing exactly what the military uniforms looked like. And he really wanted to talk to Tolstoy about it, because Tolstoy clearly had researched it all. And his colleagues in the School of Art said, look, there's Tolstoy. Go and talk to him, introduce yourself. And he said, no, I don't want to. And in the end, they managed to bring them together, and Leonid said, could I possibly show you the work I'm doing and talk to you about this? And he said, yes, come to my house. This was in Moscow. Leonid went, taking some of his drawings with him, very apprehensive, and showed them to Tolstoy. And once Tolstoy started looking at them, he ran to the door and called his daughter and said, come here, come and look quickly. Look, when the squirrel is so old it has no teeth, then they bring nuts for it. here are the illustrations that he'd been longing for the whole of his writing life. And he therefore asked Leonid to illustrate the next novel that he was writing, which was going to be Resurrection. And Leonid did this, they had this collaboration, and a great friendship grew up between them. Leonid would visit Tolstoy in Yasna Polyana. Tolstoy would read the next installment of the novel. Leonid would go back to Moscow, would prepare the drawings, and then go back to Yasna Polyana and show them. And then when they had the okay, he would go back and they would be sort of fixatived and sent off to the printers of the journal Neva in St. Petersburg. Tolstoy wrote, much of the Resurrection is about prisons and low life. And Tolstoy was not able to visit the prisons and the courts and so on, because he was already persona non grata. But Leonid at this time was still not a particularly well-known artist. And so he would go to to one of the prisons. This is the men's wing, and this is the visiting hour. The prisoners are on this side, and their families are on the other side. And they're obviously, all of them are shouting, and they're trying to hear what is being shouted to them. And it's a grim picture, but it's absolutely realistic. And then he went to the women's ward, where, I find myself noticing, you immediately see this figure of a fallen woman in distress, two other women trying to support her, a child, a woman feeding her baby. This is the woman's ward. You can see why Tolstoy was grateful to Leonid for the illustrations he did. They then did a reissue of the novel, for which a single volume, a Jubilee volume, and Leonid did special coloured illustrations. This is the fallen woman of this novel at the station where she has tried to speak to the young nobleman who caused her fall and who ignores her. And the train is leaving and she's in the rain and the smoke from the train. So next one. So Leonid spent a lot of time at Yasna Polyana. This is Tolstoy in the corner of the sitting room at the top on the first floor in Yasna Polyana. It hasn't changed at all because everything has been kept exactly as it was, with this paper-shaded lamp, with these chairs and this nice round table and a bust in the corner there. And when Tolstoy, in his last weeks, left home and died in the station at Ostapova, his widow asked Leonid to go to the station and draw Tolstoy on his deathbed. You can see him there. The bed was surrounded with cut pine branches. Boris went with Leonid, and he describes the scene. I think it's in Safe Conduct. And he fills the scene with crosses. There are the crosses of the window behind the bed, and there are the crosses of the pine trees, branches. And he said it's like a thunderstorm that's in the room, a presence of great power. Okay. Now to return to the historic scene a bit more. This is something that was shown to me, a little drawing that was shown to me by my uncle Shura, Boris's younger brother, when I first visited Moscow in 1960, immediately after the death of Boris. I went with my mother when she went there the first time after their departure in 1921. And Shura showed me this drawing, which is of the Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, a trustee of the art school, who was the governor general of Moscow and the younger brother of Tsar Alexander III and the uncle of the next and last Tsar. And it's a caricature of this figure, who is very stiff and very tightly corseted and very upright, but actually also a patron of the arts. And in the Stalin period, Shura did what he had to do not to be found in possession of this drawing of a Romanov. He tore it into 4 pieces, and he put each piece in a different bit of the house, in a matchbox or in between the leaves of a book. And only way after everything had settled down did he stick the 4 pieces together again. That I'm afraid that poor Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, he had to begin his role as Governor General by implementing an imperial decree expelling 20,000 working-class Jews from Moscow in 1892, and in 1896 he was held responsible for the Hrdinka field tragedy, where a stampede for free gifts on the day of Nicholas II's coronation trampled 1,300 people to death. And the Grand Duke was the only member of the Romanov family to be assassinated in the abortive December Revolution of 1905, blown to bits by a terrorist bomb that literally landed in his lap. Okay, so now we come into the period of the 20s. Next one. In August 1917, Leonid was invited to attend a historic lunch of the old generation of revolutionaries. So sorry.
Sorry.
This was a historic lunch, a reunion of the old generation of revolutionaries after a meeting of the provisional government. These were all survivors from the late 1880s, activists in 1905, most of whom were subsequently imprisoned, exiled, or fled abroad. And they returned to Moscow with the fall of the Tsarist regime. So left to right is the hostess, who is almost invisible, and then Katerina Brishkovskaya, who is known as the grandmother of the revolution, and then Prince Kropotkin, Tchaikovsky, Burtsev, and Morozov. Leonid had heard of Brishkovskaya, and he had not heard of any of the others. His account of this occasion is disarmingly unworldly and ends ominously. I remember how a very gentle old man with a big white beard got up from the long table set for lunch and came to meet me with an affable smile. In his entire figure, a manner of speaking and bearing, I recognized a very well-bred aristocrat in the true sense of the word, which, as I learnt later, he actually was. This was Prince Kropotkin. My whole problem was that I'd never even heard of him. I'd never been interested in politics, never belonged to any party, and never read anything of Kropotkin or any of the rest of them. And the next day they all vanished, and the Bolsheviks came in their place. Well, how did they vanish? Brishkovskaya emigrated to America in 1919, Tchaikovsky fled to Paris and died in exile in 1926. Burtsev was arrested by Trotsky on the first day of the October Revolution, freed at the request of Gorky, and emigrated to Paris. Morozov withdrew from politics and as a scientist lived to his 90s, and Prince Kropotkin held no posts after the October Revolution and publicly opposed the excesses of the new regime, mercifully dying in his own bed in 1921. So, that was in 1919. Here is Lydia. Okay, next one. These, the next two pictures are reproductions of sketches that no longer survive. In the case of both drawings, the Soviet government bought them from the Pasternak family in 1924, and then they must have been destroyed afterwards. So, this is the meeting of the Presidium of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee in 1920. And if you start at the right, move round like that, we have Kamenev, arrested and executed in Stalin's first show trial in 1936. Rykov, arrested in 1937, executed in 1938. Yanukidze, arrested and executed in 1937. Kalinin, who was nominal head of state from 1919 to 46, managed to crawl to a natural death. Sosnovsky died in prison in 1937. Bukharin, arrested and executed in 1938. Kusulyov, arrested and died in prison in 1937. Tomsky committed suicide in 1936. Utovinov committed suicide in 1924. Avenesov died in 1930. No details survive. And in the next one we have the meeting of the Supreme Soviet of National Economy 1921. This drawing was also bought by the Soviet government in 1924 and is lost for the same reasons. New faces, same fates. I shan't go through all the names this time, but in these two pictures, out of the 17 cities, only 2 survived. Leonid was having to make a living at this point by being, in effect, an artist journalist and simply recording these meetings. And it's not surprising that he wanted to leave in 1921. However, which way around am I going to tell this to you? Well, in the 30s, Leonid was wanting to return to Russia, especially as things got worse in Germany. He was corresponding with Boris, and they both were talking in coded terms, so that Boris called the Nazi regime your landlady's sickness. I know it's difficult for you in Germany with your landlady's sickness. Both sons in Moscow knew that Leonid's plans to return to Moscow under Stalin's regime of terror was suicidal. Boris was trying to explain to Leonid not to come at the same time as not to offend him, saying, yes, of course you can stay with us, but, the weather's not very good, in effect. I mean, he did actually have some very elaborate coding in his letters, which Boris's son, Yevgeny, actually only managed to unpick in again, the beginning of this century. Anyway, Leonid thought that he was going to be coming back to Moscow for a sort of a welcome, and that there was indeed a man there who was planning to give him a one-man exhibition. And we now know that this person was arrested and evidently liquidated. So if Leonid had gone back with his wife, it's not, he wouldn't have survived. Fortunately, things got hot in Germany. His pictures were already crated and were in store at the Soviet embassy in Berlin, awaiting transport to Moscow. And there was a list out for Russian citizens who had to return, and they were going through it alphabetically. And before they got to the letter, because the Nazis were sending them back to Russia, before they got to the letter P, Leonid and Rosalia came to England. But I suspect that Leonid actually understood more than he even says in his letters, because when we started trying to sort out all the pictures in our house, we found a very odd picture, which actually Mikey has hanging in his house. We couldn't think what it was, and it looked extremely uncharacteristic. In the end, we decided it was, it looked like a ballet scene. You could see sort of dancing figures there. You could see a kind of audience here. You could see the flats of the scenery in the background. And it had been rolled up, and he brought it from Germany to England. So we gave it to the Courtauld to restore it and stretch it. And they took infrared photographs and told us that there were some interesting images that they discovered under the oil. Next. Faces. You can see those three faces. If you go back, they are these faces here, and that's the lamp. I think he left little faces so that he would remember roughly where everything was. If you look carefully, you will see that there's an ear and a face there. And there's another one there. And there's a quite clear one here. So what is the picture? Right. This is actually the most important of Leonid's multiple political portraits, the Presidium of the 7th Congress of the Soviets, held in Moscow's Bolshoi Theatre in 1919. It exists in an impressionist pastel study, which Leonid brought to England with him. And in fact, you can see here is a line of faces. There are the curtains, and this became the foreground of an audience in the oil. And it also survives in the partial remainder of another study owned by Alexander, but I'm going to jump to the preparatory charcoal version of this work, dated 1920 and now lost. Around this table you can now easily recognize Lenin, and second to his left Trotsky, and then Kalinin, Kamenev and Zinoviev. And of course Trotsky was murdered in Mexico in 1940, Kamenev and Zinoviev executed in 1936, and Kinukidze in 1937. So Alexander simply cut off the right-hand side of his sketch and only kept this bit with the head of Lenin. This is it was actually the most fascinating of all the discoveries that we made in Leonid's work, because it showed so graphically what was going on, not only in terms of political history, but in terms of the way it impacted on other people's lives. However, I don't want to leave Leonid's work with just these political images, because they are not his best things. They are, above all, a sad memento mori. Leonid was an artist and not a politician. A third of his creative lifetime still lay before him when he left Russia for Germany. I'm going to just run very quickly through a run of pictures now to give you some sense of his range. He's best remembered for his dreaming oils of the Odessa coast, where he had hoped in vain to retire. His vibrant Moscow cityscapes. I think there's another one. No, and then the dazzling colours and broad vistas of the Russian countryside. This all came from one particular holiday where, for some reason, it was a place which had fantastic sunsets. So these are trees in autumn, and then you have a grey day, and then you have the sunsets. It's the same tree again. And then that one I think is absolutely staggering. It's fantastic colours. He had a wonderful eye for colour. Okay, then you have his sumptuous views of Palestine, of Bavaria, of the Baltic. His still lifes, a watermelon, black grapes, and flowers. And his gallery of portraits embraces the cultural elite of his days in Russia and in Germany, from musicians like Rachmaninoff and Shaliapin, to scientists like Einstein, writers like Gorky. And above all, his masterpieces are his daily, informal, intimate sketches, which you've already been seeing all this time, of his wife. I think that is another of those wonderful early paintings, again with this broad expanses of empty canvas that are part of the picture. And Rosalia did so many pictures of her asleep, and she tended to sleep half on her stomach. Quite unusual, very sort of tenderly observed. Okay, so there's his wife, the Nyanya. Oh no, that's a wonderful image of her. He was painting a self-portrait on his easel, and clearly she was sitting and thinking, and he just turned it over, took the back of the canvas, turned it this way, and this wonderful sketch of her is the best image we have of her, actually, isn't it? Okay, and then there's the family's Nyanya. What else? I can't remember now. Show me. Oh yes, and then Josephine and Lydia listening to Rosalia playing the piano, and then reading, which you've seen already. And this is Alexander. Alexander and then Boris both managed to come to Germany and see their parents in 1923. And then they went back to Russia, and they never saw them again. In the blackout of the war, communication between father and sons dwindled to the rare telegram. November 1942, Moscow. Wire received utmost joy, especially about father. Embrace, hoping future meeting, Boris Pasternak. In Russian, we have a handwritten draft for a letter that was never sent. 22nd of August 1943, Oxford. My dear son, Boris, how are you all? It is a very long time since we last heard from you. Thank God we are all well. My sweetest Borja, don't leave me in my old age, my 82nd year, without a whisper. Loving you, your papa. In 1944, only one of 12 copies of Boris's translation of Antony and Cleopatra arrived with a handwritten dedication. My dear father, you on your path are always before me. You are such a consummate artist, I am covered in shame when I think of my insignificance and enforced sterility. Oh, my dear, dear ones, when will I see you? In 1945, Leonid died, and Boris telegraphed his sisters. Crushed down by dreadful news, how to survive the irrecoverable loss of this sad, discoloured life without the admired great man, artist, life, example. Poor, poor dear father.